Hello, I'm Jason Turvey, the middle-aged revolutionary, and joining me again to review Paul Embery's book "Despised: Why the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class" is my friend and comrade Terry Eaton. Terry, how are you?
Oh, Jason, how are you, mate? All right,
Very
everyone.
well, very well. Looking forward to Christmas.
Yo,
It's taken
yes,
us for bloody ever to do this review, but we've got there. We're on to the final chapter,
yeah.
um, and the final chapter of Paul Embery's book "Despised" is entitled "What is to be done?" Chapter 5. What is to be done? Now, those of you who are of a certain political bent, who were hoping possibly for some sort of Lenin-esque final chapter, I'm afraid you might be slightly disappointed. But basically, what Paul Embery does in this final chapter is to lay out a blueprint for what he thinks needs to happen. And I'm going to have to say this straight out away. If the Labour Party was to win a general election again. Now, just to set a bit of context, because this book was written over 4 years ago, in the aftermath, really, of Jeremy Corbyn's defeat in the 2019 general election. This is a blueprint for how Labour in that post 2019 general election period for rebuilding itself. Okay, so it could come back to power at some point in the future. Now, clearly, what Paul Embery could not have foreseen at the moment he wrote the book was that the Tories would go through a tumultuous 5 year period from 2019 to 2024. He couldn't have foreseen perhaps the rise of reform and the fact that, frankly, Labour in July 2024 fell arse backwards into a massive majority, in fact, the biggest majority since 1997, even though the popular vote that they garnered was less than they garnered in 2019. So the whole landscape politically has changed in the last 5 years. Um, it's true to say, I think, in summary, before we go into the meat and potatoes of the actual chapter, but the lessons that they hadn't learned when Paul Embery wrote his book have still not been learned. And Labour are still the same petty bourgeois, Fabian-esque, pro-imperialist, social democratic party they were then, and have been for a long time. But of course, by way of context, we now have a party that has not learned the lessons and yet tripped over and fell into power in July 2024. So, Terry, before we begin, what were your reflections on this chapter? What is to be done?
Well, when I read the chapter, and this was a while ago, it was when the book first came out, and you had it, and we looked at it, and I thought, yes, this is a great book. I mean, this is an answer. This is the answer. This was when we were in the Workers' Party,
Yeah.
and we go to the last chapter, and it's everything, as you say, that the Labour Party could do to improve, and you could agree when I first read it. Well, coming to do this book, and obviously I've read the book and then read each chapter before we've come to do and so I've obviously read this chapter again last week and this week, and even looked at the more notes today. And I've come to the conclusion what I thought was going to be a very difficult chapter to debate or to analyse. I think it's probably one of the easiest of the book because, as you say, we'll go on to it and you'll see the points will come out for everyone, but they haven't. They are the same. They are the same as what they were before, and to us that was a failure. So if Paul Embery is asking them to go back to doing what they were doing before when they failed, what's the point?
Yes. Yeah.
So
Well, I mean, as to paraphrase Einstein, the definition of insane
yeah,
is trying the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, isn't it? Um, but yes, I'm afraid the Labour Party won't have learnt any of the lessons that Paul is saying that they should have learned from 2019, and they even less need to learn those lessons now because they're in power with an enormous majority.
mm-hmm.
So, you know, well, one of the areas, perhaps not one to go into in great detail at the moment because it's not in evidence in the book, but obviously last week, majority, I think it was, of Labour MPs voted for assisted suicide.
Yes.
So look out soon for poor people being put down for being poor. You know, a
Yeah. Well,
really
that's
regressive step in my view. Really regressive.
the point I've made about that. And so, being a pensioner, it's one of them things that they've tried to kill us with COVID. They've tried with the fuel allowance, and now that they just want to kill us. Well, when we're all dead, we won't be a burden anymore, will we, on society? And then there you go, because we're non-productive, really, unless they want to drag me out and put a postal bag over my shoulder and see if I can still do what I used to, which is
Mm,
very
mm.
doubtful at my age. But no, I didn't agree with it. Years ago, I might have done, based
Yes.
on paying the people that I'd seen people who had cancer and that went through, and the fact. But I wouldn't trust these bastards to not do something that was detrimental to old people, ill people, sick people, people who
Poor people.
benefit
Yeah.
benefit
Yeah.
miscreants, as they like
Yeah.
to call them. And that's what they've been saying. And the sounds are all the little clicks you hear, the back things, all little adverts on TV. You know, they're advertising more for Bupa and advertising more. We can't afford all that, old people,
No.
pensioners. They haven't got no money for. The majority of working class pensioners, anyway, haven't got the money for private health. But it's there being pushed in your face. And
Yeah, that's
assisted
right.
dying, it's on every bloody week.
Well, I wonder, a thought's occurred to me. It occurred to me in the last few days. I wonder if this assisted suicide bill and its passing in Parliament is part of a fundamental push to push people away from the National Health Service. We've already seen, and people who we're mutually familiar with have made posts on social media about what was called the Liverpool Care Pathway, which was a method of basically triaging people according to their chances of surviving serious diseases and illnesses, and essentially helping them out the door if it looked like the odds were they weren't going to make it. And I wonder if this is part of a generalized push to get people to consider private care, because if they thought for a second that they were going to an NHS hospital with an illness and some doctor would be pushing to have them put down as soon as they got their bum in the bed, then they might think, well, I'm not going to go there. I'll go
Mm,
Bupa. At least I'll pay. They have a vested interest in keeping me alive,
mm,
because they'll claim on the insurance, they'll get an income from me. The longer I'm there, the more they get. I mean, you only have to look at in the United States, where people who have suffered serious road accidents and have spent years in comas. And you look at those people and you thought, if that was over here, they would have been telling them to switch the life support machine off a long time ago. Because whichever
yeah,
you cut it, NHS care is rationed. It isn't rationed in the same way in the United States. It's only rationed by your ability to pay for it. And they were keeping people who had been in comas for years, and they were keeping them, and the hospital doesn't mind, they're getting paid for it.
of course.
And
Yeah.
this is my worry. This is my worry. Is this, apart from the fact that getting a doctor's appointment is extremely difficult, the level of care in hospitals varies wildly from one place to another, and even from one department to another, is this just another way of nudging people of a certain financial standing into private healthcare, to say, well, they won't put me down. I don't want to go into an NHS hospital or put my teeth in an NHS hospital and come out dead. You know.
Yes. And what wasn't there a guy in? Didn't it start with a guy in Canada who asked to be euthanized because he was homeless and he was just sick of being cold and hungry, and he said, "I'm just away, put me down." And they crowdfunded it anyway, saved
Yes,
the
that's
guy.
right.
But
Yeah,
then the thought in your mind goes, somebody's thinking, now if we could get rid of all this raft of disability people, think about the money we'd save there,
exactly.
and
Well,
we could.
sorry, where the assisted suicide bill has crossed the Rubicon is that case in Canada. The guy was living with two other people, I believe, in an assisted living facility. So it was
Mm,
a privately owned house that he was getting subsidized rent for. He was living there with two other people. The person who owned the home decided that they were going to sell, putting the three of them out on the street. With his disabilities, he didn't work, and with his income, he couldn't afford to live in a place on his own. And so his sort of flow chart took him from being made homeless to deciding to kill himself because he didn't see any other option. He couldn't afford to live on his own, and he didn't have the money behind him to find a place of his own elsewhere. He couldn't work, so he had to die. And the only reason why he got to that conclusion was because Canada has assisted suicide.
Yeah.
If he didn't have that as an option, then all right, he could have topped himself of his own volition. But he's been given by the state in Canada a lovely, fluffy, soft option. Just shuffle off this mortal coil if you're too skint and you can't survive. And it's that terrified me.
Yeah,
when they were debating this bill last week. Absolutely terrifying. Anyway, let's not digress any further. Perhaps we'll have to do an assisted suicide episode at a later date. But we'll get into the meat of the chapter. Chapter 5, what is to be done. And just going to do things ever so slightly different. I would write notes for each particular quote in previous episodes, but we decided to do something different, which is to simply read out the quote and then just discuss the reflections therein. So this was quite a hefty one, but I'll try and get through it as best as I can. Quote, many who are sympathetic to the arguments set out in this book will insist that the Labour Party is a busted flush and that our efforts must be concentrated on building something new. For a variety of reasons, I do not agree. First, for all its many faults, the Labour Party remains the only UK-wide organisation that that is capable to command support, albeit diminishing, of sufficient numbers of working class voters to stand even a chance of winning power. Secondly, the history of the attempts to create a new party on the left is not exactly an illustrious one. Third, for as long as the institutions which act as the official voice of workers, the trade unions, remain affiliated to Labour, we need to organise with and among them. Ultimately, we must operate where the movement operates. And fourth, the Labour Party has traditionally swung from right to left and back again, sometimes when the chances of any shift seemed remote. For example, who would have predicted just a few months before Jeremy Corbyn became leader the seismic change in the party that was about to occur? So, in this particular passage, Embery sets out basically his approach to the entire chapter, which is to set a blueprint for change aimed solely at the Labour Party. Okay.
Yeah.
He has, in the first few paragraphs of the book, dismissed anything else. He's dismissed revolution. He's dismissed radical social democracy with a new party starting from dust. He's dismissed every other option, and he's put all his eggs in the Labour Party basket. And again, we're talking and recording this at a time where we have a Labour government with the biggest majority in Parliament since 1997, but we're also talking about a political party who was elected on a lower popular vote than it got 5 years previous. And so it is as things stand, a party electorally that's in a slow but steady decline. And I understand we're talking about a book that was written 4 years ago, but we are also talking about sort of setting in train a series of steps to reform a party that has long since abandoned the working class, has always been a backer of British imperialism, even to the point where it's used imperialism to immolate certain sections of the working class, the Labour aristocracy and others. And here we are with Paul Embery basically setting out his arguments why, whatever his conclusions are in the book, his conclusions should be superimposed onto the Labour Party. In fact, the only point in his 4 that he makes that I have any sympathy with is the second point, which is the history of the attempts to create a new party on the left is not exactly an illustrious one. And that's because, in my view, there are so many antagonisms within the modern left that makes it almost impossible to form a reformist, social democrat, bourgeois party with what's left of the left in this country. I just don't think it's possible. I believe there are too many opposing elements in terms of the fact that it's dominated, or say dominated. It's certainly very much influenced by the Trotskyites, who are, of course, a pro-imperialist formation and have a pro-imperialist tradition. We have a lot of modern leftists who think that they are socialist in inverted commas because they believe in identity politics. They believe in things like Black Lives Matter and LGBTQ plus rights, and things like that. They believe that is what are the identifiers of a socialist, which of course is complete garbage. So yes, he's right in that regard. He is correct. It's going to be very, very difficult. As we saw, you mentioned earlier on about the Workers' Party. We saw how difficult the Workers' Party of Britain found it in the July 2024 general election. They had one seat when they walked in, and they had none when they walked out. And let's be honest, we've had so many formations over the years, haven't we? You know, not just the Workers' Party.
Yeah,
Sorry, go on.
all these formations in that second point would have to be, in Embery's view, kind of party to replace Labour. So they would do all the things that he wishes Labour would do but won't. But that this new party rising out the ashes like the Phoenix, like the Workers' Party thought, their motto was to replace the Labour Party.
Yeah.
Now, if you replace like with like, you've got like, you've just got the same.
Yeah.
There's no difference. The Workers' Party's 10-point programme's very good. You can agree with all of it. But there's loads of things that Labour say you can agree with. Not so much what these are saying now, but in the past, they've said these things, nationalisation. They never do them. It's easy to have a manifesto that says lots of stuff and then just throw it out the window once you get a landslide.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing, you know, not wishing to make this Workers' Party centric, but one of the things that I've noticed is that 10-point plan has been pushed right down the agenda. The Workers' Party, and I'm willing to be corrected if I'm wrong on this, but the Workers' Party seem to be very, very keen not to tell you about the 10-point plan, and instead to tell you about, obviously, the plight of farmers and their inheritance tax woes, you know, and to you know, attach themselves to any, you know, contemporary subject at the moment. But to pick up on, I mean, I'm looking at the right. So, I mean, let's go from inside. We've already done the second point, and I do agree with Paul. I believe a lot of the a lot of the left. This is actually that's a very important point. None of the formations of the left have been from a working class base, and that, in a way, explains why they frankly have been so shit. Okay, they've been dominated essentially by the sort of politics of the student cohort. They've been dominated by the politics of the more privileged end of the working class and the middle class, the Fabians, that sort of thing. You know, the idea, as I've said in my article about Wetherspoons that I published on my website the other day, that the working class are a charity case. They are the subject of politics, not the object of politics. And the idea that these people can be helped by others and not that they can help themselves. The working class, and I would argue, one of the reasons why new parties of the left have not started from or have not become successful is because they're not rooted in any working class base.
Yeah,
they're not. But to pick up on the other points, so we'll go with the first one. First, for all its many faults, the Labour Party remains the only UK-wide organisation that that is able to command the support of sufficient numbers of working class voters. I mean, are we sure that's even true anymore? I mean, the high point of Labour's support amongst the working class was in 1951, a general election that they lost. Their support base from the working class diminished steadily in the 73 years since. Doesn't show any signs of recovering. And they didn't rely on their working class voter base. If you can assume that they had one, they didn't rely on it in the general election that has just gone. In fact, if there was any working class participation in Labour's return to power, it's because they were voting for reform. And by voting for reform, they destroyed the Tories. And it was that. Sorry.
The reason also, do you not agree that they got elected because a lot of their base, they didn't go back to looking at the base. The base ignored them. Their base people that they rely on just didn't vote. That's okay. They got in because, as you say, reform took a lot off the Tories, and I think the Tories were knowing that they were on the way out. Look, let's leave it for 5 years. We'll come back in after that.
Yeah,
they know how the score works. But I don't think that the Labour Party have ever had. And if anyone wants to try and bring up a new party, I'd suggest that they weren't like the Labour Party, that they were something that just did appeal to the working class, and that's it. Don't worry about your academics because they will vote how they want. But the working class are the ones who haven't bothered voting. I know I'd speak to all my mates, so I couldn't be bothered.
No, couldn't be bothered. They are all the same. And let's be clear about the voter numbers in the 2024 general election. The biggest single cohort of voters were none of the above. 40% of the eligible electorate didn't vote. At the lowest turnout since 2005 in a general election in this country. So it was just under 60%. Now, to be fair, I think I said in a previous recording that was about 20% more than I thought it was going to be. But you know, the apathy that has set in amongst the voters, or the voters in general, but in the working classes in particular, was manifest in this general election, wasn't it? 40% of voters, the majority of if there was one single party in inverted commas that won the election, it was none of the above.
Yeah,
40.3%, I think.
I mean, probably, you've got like some traditional Labour voters who are working class who couldn't stomach voting reform, just didn't vote. Some that were on the edges thought, well, okay, it's not the Tories, it's not. I'll go for reform because it's a halfway house, if you like. I can see why that's a part, and a lot of people who were Tories who were disappointed voted for reform. Because you certainly won't get a lot of the Tories disappointed voting for Labour. Not in my view, anyway.
Yeah.
So the votes had to come from somewhere, and they certainly didn't come from right at the bottom. So
well, I mean, essentially what you've got is what the apparatchiks in the Labour Party during the Blair years wanted. They believed that Labour's best chance of winning power was to make the battleground as small as possible. If you could disaffect enough voters so they wouldn't bother voting because they thought, well, you're all the same, then that means that you've got a much smaller cohort of voters to persuade. You only have to swing a few over to your cause to get yourself over the line and to get elected. And that's exactly what happened in July. But looking at the remaining 2 points of this particular passage. Third, for as long as the institutions which act as the official voice of workers, all right, we can debate that, the trade unions remain, well, all right, let's be the official voice of workers organise 20% of the entire workforce. Now, if you're right, okay, I would debate whether the trade unions are the official voice of workers. If they're only organising 6 million out of a 30-odd million, 32, I think it's 32 million workforce, are they the official voice of workers? All right, they might be the official voice of public sector workers. But beyond that, I would strongly contest whether or not the trade unions really are the voice of workers. And I mean, while we're on this, and this is our wheelhouse, trade unions, how many of those stuffed shirts, how many of the Sharon Grahams and the Mick Lynches actually are speaking on behalf of their members and not themselves and their own class interests?
I'd say none of them, but that's our view, isn't it? I mean, a lot of people would say that Mick Lynch is a great speaker, and I say, yeah, but he says a lot. But really sift into what he says. Sharon Graham says a lot, but a lot about nothing.
Yeah. And both of those people, we're not going to pick on those two. I could pick on those.
No, we can pick on a few others if you want. But
yeah, exactly. But these two are the ones who've put themselves forward as the spokespeople for the working class.
Yeah.
And both of them are long-standing trade union bureaucrats
Yeah.
and have been for a long, long time. You know, these are people who've been at the very, very upper ends of their respective trade unions for many, many years. They haven't come from the grassroots of the party and accelerated all the way to the top. They've been at that top level for a long time. They're every bit as detached from the working class as every
Exactly.
other trade union general secretary or any other paid official in the trade union movement.
Yeah.
But to finish the point, for as long as the institutions remain affiliated to Labour, we need to organise with and among them. Ultimately, we must operate where the movement operates. Well, you know, we've said before, and it's worth saying again, there has been for decades a chasm between the membership of the trade union movement and its leadership. Always has been. There are many positions, affiliation to the Labour Party being one, Brexit being another, where if they had actually bothered to go amongst their membership and actually ask them, not just send them a ballot paper and expect them to go to the trouble of posting it back, but actually ask them what they thought, their positions on both of those things would be completely different.
Correct.
But that's why they don't ask them.
Yeah.
Precisely why they don't ask them. They don't want them to get involved in Brexit and their position on the European Union. And they certainly don't want them to get involved in their position on the Labour Party. Because, as I've said many times, there are people at the top of the Labour Party and people at the top of the trade union movement who are exactly the same in terms of their background, their political outlook, their affiliations to the Labour Party and so on. And they will flip between the two all the time. There are people that will move from the Labour Party into the trade union movement and back all the time. And so it's in their best interests to maintain this servile relationship with the Labour Party.
Mm.
And just to finish my point before I take another sip of water, it's worth saying this. There is a belief amongst certain people of a right-wing position that the Labour Party is led by the nose by the trade union movement. That's bollocks, okay? That's absolute bollocks. It's the other way round. The trade union movement is led by the nose by the Labour Party. And we've seen that. We've seen that with the collapse of the postal workers' strike last year. We saw that this year with the, I wouldn't name it necessarily as a collapse because there were a lot of people getting very sweaty under the collar about how much the train drivers got. But as they've very quickly accepted a below inflation pay deal, and I say below inflation pay deal over the duration of the claim, going back to 2019, it was 5% over a 5-year period. It was below inflation. When you see where inflation was in that intervening period, they accepted it very, very quickly. Presumably because the drivers were a bit worn down about having not had a pay rise for 5 years. But the point I'm making is that Labour are very, very good at getting deals buttoned up with their affiliated unions very quickly when they need to.
Yeah.
And that is not, in my view, evidence of a Labour Party being pulled along by the trade unions. It's the trade unions being pulled along.
Yeah, it's the other way around.
And the final point, the Labour Party has traditionally swung from right to left and back again, sometimes when the chances of any shift seem remote. And he mentions Jeremy Corbyn. Now, all right, putting aside our own personal views about Jeremy Corbyn and his weakness as a leader, more a convener than a leader, in my view. But there we are. We'll put that to one side. The fundamental truth is, for me, that the Labour Party has not swung from left to right. It has always been run and dominated by the right.
Yes.
The difference between the left and the right in the Labour Party, and we'll use Jeremy Corbyn's tenure as an example, is that when the left have had power, they've always acceded to the right. They've always placated the right. Whereas when the right takes power, they destroy the left.
Yes, they
They've
do.
always destroyed the left. And we only have to see what happened in the Labour Party after Sir Keir Starmer was appointed leader. One of the first things he did was throw Jeremy Corbyn out of the party, took the whip away from him. You know, went through a purge of expelling anti-Zionists from the party, some of whom were Jewish. And, you know, the right in the Labour Party is utterly ruthless. when it comes
Yes.
to dealing with the left, and the left, frankly, are crap. They're useless because they think they need the right to win power, and they've always
Yeah.
believed that. That's why so many people on the left, including those people I knew at the time in the trade union movement, supported Sir Keir Starmer when he ran for leader, because they got to a point after the 2019 general election that they didn't care who was in charge. They just needed someone that could get them back in power again. And that's what happens to the left and the Labour Party. They always collapse to that position when
Yeah.
they suffered a loss. Always.
Yeah, they do. I'd actually underline that last paragraph, that point 4, because, like you say, they have never swung from right to left. It depends what you call left and back again. They've always been, as you said, right wing, in my opinion. And given the chance, yeah, they kick the boot in. I mean, okay, people don't agree with militants and that, but when they were on the rise, when Kinnock had the right wing, he destroyed them.
Mm.
And it's happened with others.
Yeah,
You get rid of them.
I mean,
If they're a threat,
yeah,
you
exactly.
get rid.
Yeah, of course. I mean, examining the leadership of the Labour Party at that time, it was considered to be quite a balanced team, wasn't it? So you had Neil Kinnock, who was considered to be some sort of lefty firebrand, which
Oh
again
yeah, he
was
was.
bollocks. But
Yeah,
lefty firebrand, used to write in Trotskyite publications, very, very left wing in his rhetoric, at least. And then you had Roy Hattersley, who was the much more moderate, right leaning deputy leader of the party. So there
yeah,
was a bit of the old yin and yang going on. But let's be clear. The left-wing firebrand was the one that destroyed militant tendency. I mean, it did start before he come to leader. It was happening under Michael Foot's watch, but he really ramped it down during the
yeah,
80s to purge the more more revolutionary, inverted commas, elements of the
yeah.
party. So he wanted them swept away because they were giving, in his view, his party a bad reputation.
Yeah,
You
and
know,
that's the stupid part about it. If you just won't let me interrupt, because, like you say, the right always crushed the left. Now he's done it. He did it again. What Starmer's doing, and saying, well, we don't want the left wing to have a voice. We don't want, for argument's sake, the militant tendency to have a voice, because that's the voice of the people. Perhaps they should have been listening to that voice and saying, well, hang on, maybe some of our policies maybe need to be altered here, and perhaps we would have been different. But he still didn't win the election,
yeah,
and he got rid of the left. And Starmer, okay, he's won the election, but I only think by default,
yes,
because people at the working level have just turned around and said, look, man, I can't be asked anymore. I can't be bothered. Those that are on benefit are saying it doesn't matter if she's in or he's in, I still get me dole, and while I'm looking for a job. Well, how long that's going to go on, I don't know. But you know, so it's just a point. It comes to the point of view with voting Labour. I've not seen any change in my life, and that's what people say.
yeah,
So
yeah,
what's the point?
exactly,
So you're right
exactly.
on the thing. None of the above
None of the
is
above.
is, is exactly right.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just to pick up on the very last sentence of this particular passage. For example, who would have predicted just a few months before Jeremy Corbyn became leader the seismic change in the party that was about to occur? Now, again, should preface what I'm about to say by making clear that this passage was written over 4 years ago, but there was no seismic change in the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn. None.
No,
All the opportunities that he had to make seismic change in the Labour Party, he spurned.
we wished for the seismic change, me and you,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
people like us.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, no, just to think of one that's popped up into my head, one seismic change, mandatory reselection. Mandatory reselection would have been a fundamental step towards the left purging the malevolent elements within the Labour Party. You know, the Jess Phillipses of this world and the Tom Watsons of this world could have been swept away by mandatory reselection. And instead of pushing through, and this is something that Chris Williamson, the former MP for Derby, now a member of the Workers' Party himself, he said, if they pushed through mandatory reselection, it would have given real power back to the constituency Labour parties to pick candidates that they wanted and not what
Exactly.
the central office of the Labour Party wanted. But instead of that, he bottled it. When you had the confected anti-Semitism scandal that went on in the Labour Party, his own General Secretary led the purge of the members, including people like Mark Wadsworth and Chris Williamson and Ken Livingstone and others. You know, all of that happened on his watch. None of that was a seismic, well, it was a seismic change, I suppose, in a manner of speaking, but not the way that he's talking about.
Not the way Embery's on.
Yeah, exactly. And the fact of the matter is that after 5 years in leadership, Corbyn left the Labour Party in almost exactly the same state as he found it, with almost no changes within it. None at all.
Yeah.
And that speaks to not only the weakness of Corbyn himself, but the leadership team around him. Because again, this speaks to the idea of the left when they're in power over the right of the party when they're in power. The left should have done what the right would have done, which is swept away the remnants of the right of the party. But they didn't.
Exactly.
They bottled it.
Yeah,
they bottled it because they always bottle it.
This is what we said at the time. You know, why sit there with the people who were stabbing you in the back the week before, and sit there with them that week later?
Exactly. The fundamental difference between the right of the Labour Party and the left, the right would see their party destroyed rather than have a left-wing person win power. And we saw that during the Corbyn era. We saw what the right were doing. The right couldn't care a jot about losing in 2017 or in 2019 as long as it got rid of Corbyn.
Yeah.
Yet the left of the party put the ascension to power above any and all other considerations. Any and all other. And that is why they allow their enemies within the party to remain and to conspire against them every single time.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think we've done that. That's the first bit done. Okay, we'll move on because we're still on page 171. We're still on the Labour Party. I'm afraid it's going to be a bit Labour heavy, this particular chapter. But I'll quote from the book again. Some within Labour have argued that the party should simply accept the fact that the working class voters who have abandoned it are gone forever, that it should surrender all efforts to win them back and instead remodel itself as a party exclusively for the young, the metropolitan, the socially liberal, the graduate, the social activist, the public sector worker, and the middle class. What on earth is the party for if it is not to serve as a vehicle for the hopes, aspirations, and everyday interests of marginalised and voiceless working class voters for whom it was created? It wasn't in the first place, and who these days can be found across neglected post-industrial small town and coastal Britain. So I'll start with the second passage. What on earth is the party for is if it is not to serve as a vehicle for the hopes, aspirations, and everyday interests of marginalised and voiceless working class voters? Right. The Labour Party is for the ruling class. The Labour Party was conceived and founded by and for the ruling class to act as a safety valve when their preferred party of rule, the Conservatives, become unviable. That's why you now have a Labour Party in charge at the moment.
Yeah.
You had a Labour Party in charge in 1997 to 2010. That's why you had a Labour Party in charge from 1974 to 79. They are the reasons why. Because if you look at the conditions in this country leading up to all of those three elections, to use those three as examples, you had Teddy's government brought to his knees by the miners through two strikes in 74 and 72. In the lead up to the 97 general election, you had a Tory party that was spinning out of control in corruption and, you know, the back to basics. If you remember John Major's back to basics policy strategy, and then he had all these ministers having children with their secretaries and all kinds of other things. You know, it was collapsing into a quagmire of complete corruption. And then you look at the mess that the Tories left leading up to the July 24 general election. The Labour Party are a tool that the ruling classes use. The ruling class use the trade union movement for the same purpose. That is to siphon off anger amongst working class people against the Conservative Party and funnel it into a party like Labour who is brought to power to basically carry on managing things in the absence of the Tories until, like you said earlier, they can go away, regroup, rebrand, maybe come back. And that's basically what the Labour Party does. I mean, turning briefly to the previous passage, the idea that the Labour Party turned towards the young, the metropolitan, the socially liberal, the graduate, the social activists, and so on, since Tony Blair ascended to power, is complete cobblers. It was actually started way back when Neil Kinnock was in charge. Neil Kinnock and Roy Hattersley and the leadership cabal that was around him at the time clearly believed, and it was reflected in their actions during the miners' strike, that they didn't think that the working class voter base was necessary for them to win power. They needed to speak to the professional managerial layer of the working class / middle class in order to get elected. And that's exactly what they did. That's why they consistently kept aiming their policies at that particular group of voters. Now, as you said, it didn't work. You know, they managed to lose the 87 and the 92 elections, even by aiming at those voters, but they aimed for them all the same.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what we got to do, Terry, I think, and I hope as many people who see this video share this message with their friends and their family and their work colleagues and so on. We've got to get away from this idea that the Labour Party was founded for the working class. It wasn't.
Correct.
It wasn't founded by them. It was founded by middle class activist groups like the Fabians.
Yeah.
It was founded by the Labour aristocracy. That is the most privileged parts of the working class, who are privileged through things like skills, their pay, their position in their workplaces, and so on. And they were the Labour Party was founded not to be a socialist party, but to act as a roadblock to socialism. It was founded to stop it.
Yeah.
And every time things bubble up, and every time the Tories start blowing everything, everyone from the Labour Party to the trade union movement to the wider Labour Union try to funnel voters back towards Labour. Get the Tories out. Get the Tories out, is what they say. No one says, and replace them with who. It's just get the Tories out. So we need to really destroy this myth that the Labour Party was founded by and for the working class. It was not.
Yeah, I think when we decided that from the beginning, didn't we? When we both said beginning of the book that the Labour Party didn't represent the working class, no matter what Paul says.
Yeah,
that's he wishes they did, I think, but they don't.
No,
and they never have.
They never have. No. There may be. I mean, let's be honest. As much as the the Labour Party have, come up with rhetoric about the important place the working class have in society and how we aspire to give them everything that they want. You know, a home of their own, a nice car on the drive, decent pay. The Tories have done exactly the same thing. The Tories have said exactly the same things to the working class as the Labour Party have.
Say anything.
Exactly the same thing. So, in fact, I would argue over the last, let's go back to 79. So over the last 45 years of the two parties, the Tories generally have better placed themselves in the crosshairs of the working class better than the Labour Party have. They have sold themselves to the working class better than the Labour Party have over the last 45 years.
That's fair.
Yeah. So just to nail down the point, the Labour Party was not founded for the working class. It might have said it was. It might have pretended to have been. But it was not founded for the emancipation of the working class. It was founded to be a roadblock to socialism. And that's it. So let's move on. Middle of page 173. Again, another Labour quote. Here we go. For Labour, this ought to mean anchoring everything it does in the priorities and aspirations of the working class throughout hard-pressed and provincial Britain, and then seeking to appeal to a sufficient layer of those often less tribal, graduate and professional classes in the cities and elsewhere. But from the time that New Labour took control of the party, this process went into reverse. The party since then has focused disproportionately on appealing on the to the second half of that combination, while hoping that the working class stayed with it. And for a time, the working class did, until all trust was severed. and that has left Labour in the terrible predicament of having been abandoned by large parts of its traditional base. And again, this speaks to the point I've just made about under Neil Kinnock during the 1980s. They abandoned the working class since 1983. They've not cared about the working class. Now, I think there was, and I remember Peter Mandelson saying saying this very thing. The ruling class. Sorry, start again. The working class have to vote for Labour because they've got nowhere else to go.
Correct.
But they do have anywhere else to go. They have somewhere else to go, and that's staying at home. Like you said, talking to your friends and acquaintances up where you live, people just thought, it's not worth it. It's not worth voting. It's not what to vote for.
Yeah.
You know, and that was because Sunak was useless, and Keir Starmer looked deeply untrustworthy and not at all inspiring as a leader.
And that's turned out to be true.
And it turned out to be absolutely true. But the idea that the Labour Party was ever a real marriage of the working class and the graduate and professional classes in the cities and elsewhere, I would challenge that belief. I don't believe that it was. I believe, again, since 1951, the working class has been, on the whole, reluctant supporters of the Labour Party, often because they voted Labour because their parents did.
Yeah.
Often because they voted Labour because they couldn't bring themselves to vote for the Tories. Both in and of themselves quite reasonable reasons to vote for Labour.
Yeah.
But over the last 73 years, and in particular in the last 45 years, we've seen working class people be given less and less reasons to vote Labour.
Yeah. I think when in the 60s and 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s, when I was growing up, 50s and 60s, people, did. What should I vote for, Dad? Well, we vote Labour, so you know that's your first election, and I'd imagine everyone was in the same boat, but it was full employment basically. I mean, as I've said at previous things, and I have to repeat myself again. If you didn't have a job in the early 70s, you didn't want to work, or you were ill, and that's the bottom line. Now. It didn't really matter whether there was low turnouts then. It didn't matter whether if the Tories were in, the unions, the people on the shop floor would call strikes, and the unions would have to go, and they'd be like Lester Piggott when he didn't want the favourite to win. They'd have their feet on the bloody horse's neck as they were with pulling the people back. No, you can't do that, and they carried on doing it. And that's why wages were high, people were happier. And gradually, as time's gone on, doesn't matter who's been in, it's dwindled, gone down and down and down and down. And if the Labour Party repute to be, or purport, sorry, to be representatives of the working class, then why haven't they done nothing about the decline of the working class in all that time?
Yeah,
I can't blame the Tories. That's what Tories do,
Yeah.
But now it seems that's what Labour does as well.
Yeah, exactly.
And now that proves the point for people who may or may not watch this, who I know, will turn around and say, well, yes, so we were right. And I always say to them, you are right. You are dead right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the idea that it's been this delicately poised coalition between the working class and the non-working class is something of a myth, I've got to be honest. The working class were there, but I don't think they were very enthusiastic, and I don't think they've been very enthusiastic about their vote for the Labour Party for decades.
No. It's because they can't stomach voting for a Tory.
Exactly.
Traditionally, and okay, they've broken these link with society, like mining villages and towns that. I mean, I've just seen that Luton are shutting down their car plant, Vauxhalls now. It's going to be moved to Ellesmere Port. Well, which is where I am. But that's people in Ellesmere Port. Well, that's great. So it's not so great for 1,000 people in Luton.
Yeah, because they're not going to up sticks and move to Ellesmere Port, are they?
Well, I wouldn't have thought so. Although they say there's going to be loads of jobs offered for people from Luton. Well, okay, if you're young, and I do know that. Oh, if you were selling your house in Luton and were moving up and buying a similar house in Ellesmere Port, it'd probably cost you half the price. So you would be better off in that respect. But whether you'd want to move up to the the grim and grimy north from the sunny.
Blimey. Well, I mean, it's of course, yeah, you're right. If you're young and you don't have the ties necessarily to the area, you might consider doing it. But if you've got a family that's got a support network that helps look after the kids and things like that, up in sticks and moving a couple of hundred miles up the road to Ellesmere Port,
yeah,
you know, a completely different part of the world is very daunting. And I suspect that a lot of people working in the Luton plant won't take that.
No, it's different if they were only relying on one wage, and then the guy could say, well, I can travel there, I can live in digs, and I can look for a house whilst we carry on. But it's more than likely the men or women that work in Luton, their partners work to maintain a standard of living. So that would mean he comes home and says, or she, I'm getting made redundant. I think we're going to move to Ellesmere. No, we're not. I've got my job here.
Yeah.
You've also got that to look at.
Of course, yeah, absolutely.
It's not the same. It's not the same as in the past when whole places moved down and people moved to the other end of the country for the work. Like in my dad's time in the buildings, lots of people came up from Wales and moved into the Merseyside and the northwest area because there was nothing in Wales, only coal mining. And if you didn't want to be a miner, well, you'd have to be a farmer.
Yeah.
And my dad moved up and got work in the northwest. And that's where we stayed. It's the same for a lot of families.
Exactly. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I don't think they're going to do it this day and age.
Well, exactly. So we'll return to the book where Embery talks now about the demographic of the Labour Party. And I don't think anyone will be very surprised by what he says here. Top of page 174, quote, the party today is too much Hampstead and not enough Hartlepool.
Yeah.
The pendulum needs to shift decisively back the other way, in the way that New Labour calculated in the 1990s that it needed to appeal to greater numbers of the middle class if it was to win power. Now it is the working class to whom it must reach out, and it is the middle class, liberal, left, young, graduate, metropolitan element of the party which is called upon to make the compromise. Yeah, like that'll happen. I mean, God blimey. I mean, the middle class, liberal, left, young, graduate, metropolitan element run the party. They are the party. They're the majority of their members.
Absolutely.
So why on earth would they compromise for a bunch of people who these lot wouldn't cross the road to spit at and who have abandoned the party years ago? And if they do still vote for them, they vote for them reluctantly. I mean, it's very easy to say, well, you're going to have to compromise and you're going to have to, collaborate more and get the working class more involved. But as the old fable goes about the rabbits saying that they think the food and the provisions should be shared out more equally when they're saying this to the lions, and the lions say, yeah, that's very fair, but it doesn't have the teeth and claws that we've got.
Yes.
It doesn't matter whether you think the working class should be more involved in the Labour Party. Those that would make that happen are not willing to make that happen.
No.
They're not interested in making that happen. So that's in my view, a very idealist position by Paul Embery. The idea that the middle class, liberal, left, young, graduate, metropolitan element of a party will simply concede to a bunch of working class people who right here, right now, aren't interested in getting more involved in the Labour Party. No, I think that's a non-starter.
Yeah, it's like he had in the previous chapter. It was our battle one before, where he had a wish list. Was it the last chapter?
Yes, that's right. Yeah,
and we said, right, looking at it, yeah, it is a list that you could write out. So it'd be lovely to have all that. And if we had a left who could run a left Labour Party for the working class, then with all the things that we would have as a revolutionary party, then maybe. But it's not going to, as you've just said, it's not going to be like that. It's run by bureaucrats. The same with the unions.
Yeah.
They'd never had their hands dirty in the effing lives. And no wonder they've gone. The most of them in the Labour Party there are all well under the age of retirement. They've got many years of grovelling in the nose in the trough.
Yeah, absolutely.
Before they have to go and ask for the magic needle. to get them sent off to
Yeah,
Valhalla.
exactly.
So they don't mind sending me off, but they're not going to send one of their own. Well,
No.
they're not going to send me off. I'll have you. I'm going to fight this all the way, mate.
Yeah, too bloody right. Too
Me and
bloody
my
right.
colleagues.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, I mean, in to sum up on this particular point, the idea that the people who dominate the Labour Party are all of a sudden going to back off and let the working class become more involved is just pipe.
Rubbish.
It's just fantasy. It's rubbish. I mean,
Yeah.
it would imply that the working class are just waiting in the wings to get more involved. If only they were allowed to by these terrible metropolitan liberal left elites. But it's not true. They don't want to get involved. They're not. They don't want to. They're not interested. They're not
No.
interested. They don't care. They don't want to get involved in it. They don't. They don't believe. Well, I mean, you know, as we've said repeatedly, the Labour Party's, you know, high point in terms of working class support was 1951. It's been in decline ever since, and it has had successive leaders, successive governments, and has failed to change that pattern. It's failed because it's not a party that was founded for their interests.
No, it's
And
not.
that's it.
It shows what we've been saying and what others have said to be correct.
Yeah.
That the Labour Party are just a buffer zone for when the Tories want to do something, but there would be hell and all to pay if they did. So they say, let the Labour get in. They'll push these policies through. We'll just carry them on when they get booted out.
Yeah.
And that's what'll happen.
Yeah, that's right. And
Short
there's only
of that,
one reason.
between now and the next general election, them doing something so absurd as to call for conscription to go to Ukraine, where you might have mass revolution on your hands.
Well, hopefully.
Well,
Fingers crossed.
exactly. Yeah.
Fingers crossed. But no, you're right. The idea that the Labour Party can all of a sudden summon up all these frustrated, isolated, disaffected working class leaders, if you like, and get them involved in the Labour Party is just a complete pipe dream. Complete. Let's move on. Top of page 176 now. Trade unions themselves, so often in the past, the route into the labour movement, into labour movement politics for ordinary workers, can do their bit by emerging from their metropolitan and public sector readouts and organising more effectively across private industry and provincial Britain. A more overtly working class labour movement would also be more effective at challenging the national class divide, which even this era of so-called meritocracy see so few individuals from working class backgrounds break through the glass ceiling and still ring fences most of the plum jobs across politics, the media, the law, public services and business for those born into wealth and privilege. All right, there's some elements of this I'm sympathetic to. One being that above all other considerations, people were held back for positions, like he said, in politics, the media, the law, public services, and so on, are held back because of their class above any and all other considerations.
Yeah.
Despite what some people might have you believe, it's class that holds people back. Whether or not a Labour Party with more working class people in it is ever going to break that pattern, I'm very, very sceptical. Not only because I don't think the working class will get involved in the Labour Party in the first place, but because, coming back to what you were saying earlier on about the ruling class's attitude to the Labour Party, there's only one fundamental reason why the Labour Party are allowed back into power by the ruling class, is because they will do what the ruling class want.
Exactly.
And that's the only reason why they are this safety valve for the ruling class. If they were going to come into government and say, right, that's it, we're sweeping away everything, we're going to start a socialist revolution from here, the ruling class wouldn't let them near it. You know, I mean, that's going back to Corbyn, and we'll obviously touch on Corbyn a bit later on. But look what the ruling class levelled at Corbyn for the very mild social democratic changes he wanted to bring in. Look what they did. They didn't want him getting a sniff of power because they were terrified of the very, very small reforms he was going to make. That's why they are quite happy with Starmer's Labour, because there will be no reforms.
Yeah.
All right, he might squeeze the farmers. You know, he might bring in, or we'll take away obviously the winter fuel allowance.
Yeah.
Ruling class don't care about that. Not bothered.
No.
Not bothered at all.
No. No, they're not.
No.
But they would be terrified if the likes of Corbyn or somebody like Corbyn was a leader who thought, we make some of these reforms, and he got his party to agree. And what they would be terrified is if local Labour parties said, this is a great idea, and all started to get behind it, then you would see a groundswell. That's when the ruling class would turn around and say, whoa, hang on. No, we're not having this.
Yeah.
We can't have these, bit grubby sort of northerners or grubby southerners, if you like, getting their hands on the levers of power. It's got to be kept with us where we can control it. We know
exactly.
this, Jason, but there's people, it's not fair because they haven't been privileged to some of the things that we have through our working lives. They've just been workers and they've just accepted what their lot is, if you like. We see the other side, and it's from things like this that people should look and say, well, yeah, those guys are both working class. They see it. I'm going to look more into this, and that's where you have to make a sort of, to try and guide people into those sort of things. I think that's what our party does quite well, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to sort of round off this particular passage by looking at the trade unions. So this is something, to be fair, that Paul Embery has been saying quite consistently for quite some time, which is that the trade union movement in this country, its power base is essentially the public sector. It's long since abandoned vast areas of the private sector in the period probably since, well, arguably since the miners' strike, 84, 85 time. The trade union movement regressed from the private sector and went for somewhere more reliable, more dependable, where there was always a steady flow of potential members, which was the public sector. I think my personal view, I don't know what you think, Terry, but one of the things that I think has not aided the private sector trade unions was their haste to merge with other unions. Their haste to merge with other unions, including, Unite. Unite essentially contains within it the merged remains of huge swathes of private sector employers, huge swathes, including things like the Banking, Insurance and Finance Union, BIFU. That ended up merging into Unite and disappeared off the face of the earth. UCAT, the Builders Union, that merged with Unite about 2 or 3 years ago and has disappeared off the face of the earth.
Yeah,
they've been resorbed by this enormous union, and I'm not attacking Unite as a union. They are obviously a merger of two very big unions a few years ago between the T&G and Amicus were merged to form Unite. But that direction of travel, where these smaller private sector unions have found themselves with no apparent option but to merge with a bigger union, hasn't helped, has it?
No, it hasn't. But it seems that they're going backwards. They're going back to when the unions were formed and we had the one big union and they all split off into the unions, the different craft and the different, thing is. I mean, the real sad thing is that when I was a branch secretary in the T&G, the T&G was the second biggest union in the world next to the Teamsters in the early 70s.
Yeah.
It was massive. And, now they've got to amalgamate with other unions to be anything. They haven't helped themselves with that, because what they've done is they've just looked after the union, not the members, if you like, if you can follow, if I'm being clear. They seem to make sure the union's okay. They don't recruit. They don't go out recruiting. They might have recruitment officers, but I don't know where they are because they're not down on Cheshire Oaks. I never see them anyway. Trying to get people from young shop workers into unions. But then people will turn around and say, well, what do I want to join a union for? I'm a minimum wage, 0-hour contractors. That's not going to change. Why do I have to spend £12 of my hard-earned cash into something that I'm never going to see anyone. But I always say it's
Yeah,
there
exactly.
as a safeguard if something does happen to you.
Well, I mean, looking at the first 2 or 3 lines of that particular passage, had the trade union movement, as is the established legacy trade union movement, had they protected and continued to recruit in the private sector, then unions like United Voices of the World, Independent Workers of Great Britain, and others, these new independent unions that appear to be centering their membership around the more transient end of the workforce, and a lot of people who are immigrants are also members of these unions as well. These unions wouldn't have a right to exist because the existing legacy trade unions would be going into these areas and recruiting, like you said, going to places like Cheshire Oaks and Braintree Village, which is near me, the shopping centres, and recruiting these poorly paid workers who've got no union representation at all, and trying to build up a power base. And let's be honest, they do have some power because they're part of the mechanism that moves money around.
Yeah.
So they do have power, and yet they've been left to rot. They stay there on their minimum wages with the very poor hours and very poor conditions. All the while, you've got trade unions like Unison, who are almost entirely organised in the public sector, who are quite happy to keep things that way. And if some other union wants to go in and recruit these people, then so be it. And therein lies the problem, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes.
So moving on then to page 177, and this is on Embery's idea of the working class values that Labour must embrace. So here we go. Quote, they, the working class, do not see themselves or their families and communities as commodities to be exploited or uprooted in the name of an unrestrained global capitalism that demonstrates no respect for the human desire to belong, nor any recognition of the value of social solidarity. They don't believe that everything must be subordinated to the pursuit of economic growth or profit. Do you think it's essentially true, Terry, that the working class don't believe that everything must be subordinated to the pursuit of profit?
Yes, I do. I do think it's true.
Hmm.
I don't suppose the working man. I can only go back to, I say working man, I'm not being denigrating to the working woman, but it's just a figure of speech from when I was a young man. We don't want looking at at the profits of a company, or we were just making sure that we were okay. And basically, we were all equal. We all had work. We all had plenty of money. And we were happy.
Yeah.
As well as people had holidays, people had cars, people bought their own houses. People were, there weren't abject poverty in my town, not to that degree there is now.
Mm.
And that's the difference. And so when the only time anyone would be interested in the profit the company was making was, and it'd be a shop steward come pay negotiation time, when you look at
Exactly.
the company accounts and they say, well, what's this amelioration? And they go, oh, well, no, well, we looked this word up and it means you're taking money off before tax that we don't know about. So, that's the top line, not this one you're showing us. You've only earned this.
Yeah.
You look at Tesco, the
exactly.
increase in profit they've made under the situation we've been in. It's
Exactly.
And I just notice things, like
well, workers in any place of social production would see their employer, for instance, share a news of a good profit, and they'd be happy because obviously that makes their position in that company more stronger, more stable, less precarious because the company's made money. And then once that's died off, which is about 10 seconds later, they're saying, well, hang on a sec, I made that profit.
I want some of it.
I want some of it back. Yeah. And like you said, the shop still be like, oh, hello there. Right, I can put this in my pay claim. The success that this company's been is largely down to the workers that created that wealth. And so they will ask for their bit of it.
Yeah, and then if the shop should have read any marks, he'd be asking, what's this surplus value we've got here?
Yeah, exactly.
And we go down another rabbit hole.
That's
then,
how you
don't
would
we?
say it. You've got a sizable amount of surplus value. My members want the full value of their labour.
Correct.
So no, I mean, again, it's like this is a fairly open and shut case, this,
Yeah.
isn't it? The
Yeah.
working class aren't motivated by profit.
No.
Because the working class don't generally involve themselves in enterprises that create profit. They are wage slaves generally. So
Yeah.
their only interest in profit is the success of their employer, in order that they can
They might get a pay rise.
they get a pay rise, or at the very least they know that they're not going to get laid off.
Yeah, the job
It's
security.
not much in the grand scheme of things, but that's basically how working class people approach it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Let's move on. We're still on page 177. Again, this is staying on the idea of working class values that Labour must embrace. Quote, but they wish for an opportunity to secure dignified work and decent wages, for their children to have a fair chance of getting on the housing ladder, for public services that do what they're supposed to do, for the streets to be safe, to have enough spare cash in their pocket to enjoy regular leisure time and an annual holiday, to live in a nation characterised by steady and stable families and communities, and of which all citizens feel proud to be a part. These voters don't object to people getting on in life. They just ask for the same chances. It really isn't complicated. And I think, well, I mean, there's a number of ways of approaching this. But the one that I'll throw out is that this passage really sums up the social democratic attitude to the working class. Now we're involved in a party that believes that whilst all of those things are laudable aims, we want the working class to become the ruling class. We don't just want the working class to have enough money in their bank account to afford one holiday a year, or to be able to go out to the cinema every now and again.
Mm.
We want them to run the country, because we think that they're the best placed people to run the country.
Mm.
Now, I mean, what we have to accept, though, is that this set of aspirations and beliefs that Paul Embery's captured here are those imposed on the working class by the ruling class, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, the adage of a fair day's pay for a fair day's work is a ruling class adage, isn't it? It's not a working
Yeah.
class adage.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
basically saying we think you should get what you are entitled to for your day's work.
What they decide we're entitled
But
to.
they decide what it is. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
But that's the thing that goes on with a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. It's say, well, no, we don't want that. We want to, as what we've said in various pamphlets, we want to abolish the wage system, because
Yeah.
under a decent society, you wouldn't need it. So there wouldn't
Yes.
be any worries for this.
Yes.
It's just giving us a little dangler while they're sitting in Crockford's playing bridge in New Bond Street or wherever Crockford's is now, and you know, next to bloody Omar Sharif's son, and they're having their high times, and the working man's just come out of, well, he would have been if there were any there, come out of the pit.
Mm.
He's happy because he's got enough money to feed his family, go and have a few pints at the weekend, or go to the miners' welfare club. They're happy.
Yeah.
When you start taking that off people, and then they start seeing these toffs, as they
Yes.
call them, having their own way and doing it, that's when you get your unrest, animosity. They're not happy whilst we. So that those it's a bit like what we say about this. I mean, that one paragraph is a bit like merry old England, where, you know, which I've always said is some people wish for the dancing around the maypole and drinking mead.
Yes.
Well, you know,
It's got a China plate kind of vibe about it, this particular bit, isn't it? You
yeah,
know, I think one of the things that I'm going to criticise Embry for this. I think one of the things that he does do, he is he's always downplaying the aspirations of the working class.
yeah,
He
yeah,
does not believe, but let's be clear, he's not a Marxist, he's not
no,
a revolutionary. I think that's obvious. But what he also does is downplays the aspirations of the working class and the great power the working class possess. That means that we and others like us believe that they can't just destroy the system that we're living in now, but they can run a new one for themselves. And that's the fundamental difference between people like Paul Embery and ourselves, is we believe that the working class can become the ruling class.
we do.
what Paul Embery believes is the ruling class should stay the ruling class, but just be nicer to the working class.
Yeah, nice to us, so we're happy with our lot.
Yes.
When we're doffing our cap at my lord as he's walking down the street. Yeah, well, that you know, that's how they would like it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And you know the things that are contained in here. I mean, look, let's be honest. I would like better public services. I would like the streets to be safe. You know, we all would like enough spare cash to enjoy an annual holiday.
Yes.
That can't be the limit of our aspiration. That
No,
can't be the limit of our desires.
that's it. It's you can't write those aspirations down on a piece of paper because that's what they allow us to have. That's what they say that we're entitled to have. They will decide what we're entitled to have.
Yes.
And then they say, well, you're all entitled to go to watch the Bolshoi in London. Well, yeah, I can go and watch it, but I can't afford to get there. I can't afford a hotel and I can't afford a ticket. So when do I get to see that? It's all right having the freedom to go and do it, but
and of course the other thing is by the time you do get there, even if you were be able to afford the fare there, the hotel you need, you'll be surrounded by people who are completely alien to you.
correct.
You'll be surrounded by ruling class people, not working class people.
Yes.
And you will, for whatever reason, feel incredibly out of place. You'll feel incredibly awkward, and you would much rather be somewhere else. You know, but yeah, it's this suppression of aspiration that is a running theme in social democracy with regards to the working class, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
So let's move on. Top of page 178 on economic policy, and he's going to talk about Corbynomics. Now, I'll be honest, I'll begin by saying before I start reading it out, I don't even know what Corbynomics even was, but let's read what he said.
When I first saw it, I thought, well, what's that then?
What is Corbynomics? What is this? I mean, you know, I've heard of Arbenomics and I've heard of Keynesianism, but I've never heard of Corbynomics. But let's have a look and see if we can unpack this. Though Corbynomics, as it became known, was portrayed by its critics as redolent of rigid Soviet-style command economies, much of it was in fact built around the kind of mixed economy Keynesian interventionist philosophy that has become the stock in trade of Scandinavian countries and underpinned the economic consensus in Britain that lasted for 3 decades from the end of the Second World War, only to be supplanted by what we now call neoliberalism. Now, of course, you might call it neoliberalism. I call it imperialism. But let's be very, very clear. The Keynesian economic interventionist economic philosophy that Embery's citing here lasted roughly from 1945 until the 70s, maybe early mid 70s. And the reason why it ended was not because of the dawn of something called neoliberalism. It was because the rate of profit in 1965 hit zero. The economy had basically ground to a halt in 1965. And with that, the ruling class decided that the post-war consensus was to end and that the working class were going to work for longer hours and for less money in more precarious work. That's what brought about what Paul Embery describes as neoliberalism. That's what caused the destruction of the post-war consensus. You know, it wasn't that they abandoned Keynesian interventionist policies. It was that the rate of profit had hit nothing, and so they had to claw back somehow.
Yeah, claw back. Well, I was just going to say, so the ruling class wanted to claw it back. That's it's all right. You've said it.
Yeah, and so the fundamental point here is that a ruling class can be as generous and benevolent as it wants to be, as long as it makes money. As long as it makes money from you as a working class person, the ruling class can be as benevolent as it wants. The moment the profit stops, they're not benevolent anymore. They then have to return to profit. And how do they return to profit? Well, they cut your wages.
Yeah, they take back what they gave you in the past.
Yep. They will make you work for longer hours. They may make more of you or less of you work in a factory to do the same amount of work. They will find any and all ways to squeeze profit out of you.
Yeah.
From the product of your labour will be squeezed as much as it can be so they maintain their profit. That's what ended that post-war consensus. You know,
But it wasn't Corbynomics then.
Well, I don't even know what Corbynomics was. I really don't. I mean, all I can remember was in the lead up to the 2019 general election, the Financial Times ran an article saying that Jeremy Corbyn wanted companies to have at least one worker on its board. And, well, the ruling class had an absolute shit fit over that. They weren't having that. But let's be honest, what difference would that have made?
No, not a difference at all. I remember in the 70s they arguing about worker participation on boards, and people were going on about it. And I said, well, yeah, okay, if you want to go, we'll nominate you. You can go and sit there. But what difference you will make, because you won't understand a word they're talking about unless you're an economist, and if you are, fine, we'll go, because I ain't going to sit on a board. And then them turn around and say at a later date, well, you were there. You were a party to the decisions that were made. So why are you moaning now when your members are wanting money and we've told you there isn't any worker participation? You're going to have a vote and say, well, this year we'll have 7 people off the shop floor and only 4 people from the top of the company to run it. Well, then it's a different participation. But 1 member.
Yeah,
just a token gesture. It's like saying...
It's complete tokenism. Absolute tokenism. I mean, let's be honest. That worker goes, like you said, that worker goes onto that board of directors and will sit there, and because the ruling class deliberately suppresses his education or her education in as much as they are not raised to run their own companies or to sit on boards of companies, they're paid or they're educated to a level that allows them to work and just work. They then go onto a board and they're surrounded by people using terms that are completely alien to them, having an outlook that is completely different to theirs, whose interests are completely different to theirs. Which way are they going to go? Are they going to? Is this one worker going to persuade everyone around them to think their way, or does everyone around them think, or make this working class person think their way?
No, we know where it's going to go.
We know where it's going. Exactly.
I'm sure this came from Europe, though. It was a European directive. I'm sure it was.
Ideally, what you want is the board of directors to be made up entirely of workers, but that'll never happen. That'll never happen. So this is just window dressing.
Scheme, no.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's move on. Top of page 179 now. None of this is to say that the left should indulge the most militant voices among its ranks by adopting an anti-market position. On the contrary, it must be acknowledged that markets are not only essential to the functioning of a free and democratic society, but are often the best mechanism by which to allocate scarce resources, reward effort, stimulate dynamism and innovation, and raise living standards. A flourishing private sector must, therefore, be an objective of any party seeking to govern from the left. There is a growing acceptance, though, that in the relationship between the government and market, the former must play the role of master and not servant. And that is where the market falls short. And where market falls short, government must intervene to put things right. So this is as clear an endorsement of capitalism as Paul Embery's ever going to make.
That's exactly my view.
That's
what I've got written here.
Absolutely. Let's be clear. How many times has the government put things right, or in other words, cleared up the piss that the public or the private sector has left behind when things have gone wrong? You know, who bailed out Railtrack when Railtrack went bust after the Hatfield crash? It was the government. Now, if you had a more free market libertarian outlook, then you would allow every company that failed to go bust, because that's essentially what capitalism dictates should happen. But of course, we live in a world where capitalism is basically guaranteed by the state. So where capitalism fails, the state steps in all the time. And, you know, the idea, and I think it's something that Paul Embery alludes to in this particular passage, is that the state and market are separate, and that government can push markets certain ways and markets can push government certain ways. They're completely intertwined. They're the same thing.
Yeah. It's capitalism, as you said. That's all I wrote down by the side of this one passage was just total capitalism.
Yeah, no, it is. You know, this is Paul Embery advocating very clearly for capitalism and its perpetuation. You know,
Correct.
and as long as that perpetuates, everything that he's mentioned in the previous passages can't be fixed. And
Correct.
not just in the previous passage, the previous 4 chapters.
Well, yeah.
None of it can be fixed. The running thread throughout all those 4 chapters, from identity politics to the decline of the nation state to all the other things, to immigration and so on, is all down to capitalism. And if you're prepared to countenance keeping it, then you're going to have to live with all the things that you've complained about in the previous 4 chapters, because it comes baked into the cake.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, to say that the government must put things right when things go wrong, well, they do that anyway. I mean, need I remind anyone of what happened in 2008 when the not the entire banking sector, but a huge chunk of it fell into the sea because it was betting on what they were called mortgage-backed securities, which were basically bundles of financial packages sold that contained mortgages, and those mortgages were given to people who had no job, no income, and no assets. They were giving away mortgages to people who had no way to pay it back. And it was that, amongst other things, that tanked the whole economy in 2008. And who stepped in to bail out the banks? It was the state. It was the state, because that's what the state is there to do. So yeah, we need again, it's one of these things we're trying to disabuse people of, is to believe that the market's over there and the state's over here.
Yeah.
And they are separate entities. They are not. They are one homogeneous whole, and both have shared interests. So
yeah.
let's move on to page 180. Labour must challenge unremittingly the neoliberal orthodoxy that places undue faith in market outcomes and the wisdom of business chiefs and bankers, and by extension sees the proper role of government as little more than a bit part actor. The party must argue for an alternative that established government as a key player in the economic life of the nation, prepared to use all the tools at its disposal, fiscal as well as monetary, to achieve its desired outcomes. This would mean, by definition, the restoration of democratic control over the Bank of England. So what are your reflections on that passage, Terry?
Well, they shouldn't have given the Bank of England its own control anyway. When they did it in the beginning, restoration of control over the Bank of England. Yeah, well, yeah, I agree with that. But that's in the confines of this book and what we're talking about. But would you have that sort of a setup under a different system after a revolution or whatever? But you've got to look at, I suppose, if you decry the book as it is, you have to accept that that's what it is at the minute. I hate that word neoliberal.
Yeah, me too.
I mean, what does neoliberal orthodoxy? You know, it's just like, it makes it so awkward to people looking at it. But as you say, market outcomes and wisdoms of business chiefs, it's all capitalism. It's once again, it's
all capitalism.
Still capitalism.
Yeah.
And then giving the Bank of England the right to just decide on whatever rates of bank of interest rates and all this cable. That's been proved to be a bloody disaster.
Yeah, absolutely. Neoliberalism, just for those who are not aware, is a bit of a bullshit term, to be honest. But it basically describes, or is used to describe, the period of capitalism from 1979 to now, where and its main protagonists are Ronald Reagan in the United States, who was president from 1980 to 1988, and Margaret Thatcher, who was prime minister for over 11 years in this country. And it's all, to a large degree, window dressing. You know, Ronald Reagan made a famous speech where he said that the state was the problem, that the problem with the free market in the United States was that the state always got involved in it, and it was causing the problems. It was making regulations, it was holding back, it was stopping mergers, it was doing this, it was doing that. And the more that the state could withdraw the better it would be for everybody, because the markets would be more unfettered and be able to do exactly what they want when they wanted. It was all bollocks. It was all bollocks. Okay, it's all crap.
Well, I think anything that guy said was bollocks.
Exactly. And and the same sort of rhetoric was spewed by people like Margaret Thatcher, which was that the public sector and the state are handbrakes on enterprise. But the truth is that during the period of both of their tenures as president and prime minister respectively, they remained every bit as involved in the management of the economy as governments that went before them. I mean, let's be clear. All right, British Coal at the time was a publicly owned utility, but Thatcher's government went to war with the miners because they believed that the most powerful element of the working class had to be destroyed. That was now the free market would have suggested, well, you could have necessarily privatized British Coal, let the coal pits stand on their own 2 feet, let them make what efficiencies they needed to make as required, but all those pits would stay open. But Thatcher made sure that those pits were going to close whilst they were owned by the state. And so the rhetoric about the state being the problem, well, yeah, in a manner of speaking, the state was the problem, but not in the way that they meant it. But the state was intervening in capitalism every bit as much under Reagan and Thatcher as they were before. It was just they put a veneer on it that made it appear that the state was shrinking, that the state was getting less involved, but that was complete rubbish. And the idea that, I mean, I don't believe in neoliberalism as a thing anyway. I think basically we are still in an imperialist age, and we have been for well over 100 years. And the United States similarly so. And that is the phrase that people need to get used to learning, is imperialism, not neoliberalism.
Yeah.
So let's continue because time's pressing. Top of page 182, staying on economic matters now. However, any industrial strategy must not be so preoccupied with the future that it has a blind spot on established industries and sectors. It must, for example, place the revitalisation of our manufacturing sector at its heart. The decline of British manufacturing in 1980 accounted for almost 30% of GDP. Now it is less than 10%. And with it, the obliteration of entire industries and millions of steady blue-collar jobs and apprenticeships underlies our wider economic woes, including our perennial trade deficit. So, if you advocate for capitalism, then one of the things that you unwittingly or not advocate for is the offshoring of industry. You get to a point where, as our comrade Alex has made clear many times during some of his live casts, you go from a system that goes from using money to create commodities to make money. So you use the money to make your commodities, you sell the commodities, you get money. You cut out the commodity bit and you go straight from money to money. And what we're talking about here is a decline in British manufacturing that is a natural stage that imperialism goes through. It offshores manufacturing in cheaper countries all the time, be it China, be it Vietnam, be it Cambodia, you name it, it will offshore it. The idea that you can reshore it is a fantasy. It can't be done. Donald Trump tried it when he was last president, and he basically, the only way you could do it, and I think we've mentioned this before, give massive tax breaks or huge cash bribes to companies to build factories back in either the United States in their case or Britain in ours. That's the only way you're going to do it. That's the only way you're going to do it, because no matter which way you cut it, unless you're going to slash pay, unless you're going to ramp up hours, and unless you're going to make people do the work of 2 or 3 people at the same time, it is still cheaper to offshore industry to countries like China and Vietnam and Cambodia and others than it is to bring it back here.
No, if the manager of who I forget the name now, Streamlight or something, who owns Vauxhalls, if they said, well, no, we're not going to do this. We want to continue on making these cars or whatever. And they can just turn around and say, well, no, Or if the government said you will not move them abroad, they'll just say, well, we'll shut down then.
Yeah,
One
exactly.
way, they just shut down and go
They'll just
move the
shut
whole
down and go.
factory.
Exactly. Exactly. I
That's
mean,
the
sorry, go on.
that's now that is the threat that they would use against trade unionists, where it used to be, well, there's 4 million people on the dole. If you don't want to do the job, we can go outside there and get someone in who can. That was always what they would say in the 80s. And this is the same, but
Yeah,
if you don't like it, we'll shut your factory down.
yeah, exactly.
They're not
Exactly.
bothered where the cars are made.
No, of course not. No. And you know, this again, this is not a new phenomenon. This has been going on for decades.
Yeah.
It's not new. Production has been offshoring forever. I mean, it used to be from Britain to within what is now the European Union. So there were, especially in the south of Europe, there were places you could get goods made quite cheaply. I'll give you an example. I'll tell you what it is. This is the easiest way to do it. Marks and Spencers, okay? You used to be able to go to Marks and Spencers and the clothes would say made in England or made in Great Britain inside. Then it started to say made in Portugal. Now it says made in Bangladesh or made in Vietnam. And that's the indicator of how far a company based in Britain will offshore its work and offshore its production in order to maintain a profit. Okay. Now, I would say there's probably not many places else it can go after that, you know, beyond Vietnam, Cambodia, China for production. But that's where it goes and that's where it's gone because that's the cheapest place for it to be produced. There is no way I can conceive under capitalism that you can reshore that industry without paying people similar wages to the wages you were paying them in Cambodia. Or
if
China.
for the company to make a profit.
Yeah.
And as you say, under capitalism, I mean, obviously that's the moot point, isn't it? The system, a change in the system, you would only make what you needed as your necessaries of life.
Yes.
You don't need to make 1,000 cars if only 200 people need one. As a simple example. And food is the same. You know. You've got to cut your cloth accordingly. Now we're talking about shirts, but no pun intended.
No, but yeah, exactly that. You know, in under socialism, you would have a planned economy, where you would only make enough and grow enough for what you need. You wouldn't have this chaotic, anarchic system where you make commodities based on nothing other than you will try to sell them. And if you make too many, you have to basically destroy them because they were not used. But it would also mean that you could make your own clothes in your own country using labor from your own country with materials maybe imported from elsewhere, depending on where you are. But your industrial base is in your own country, isn't it?
Yes. I suppose those are our dreams, and these other lesser dreams are Paul Embery's, but you know, I know which ones I prefer.
Well, exactly.
If I'm gonna dream.
If I can dream. I'm not going to break into song.
No, don't do that.
Yeah, thank you. Right, so we'll carry on now. It's going to change tack slightly. So top of page 184, quote, against the background of the failings of privatisation manifested variously through higher costs, inferior services and large taxpayer subsidies, there is a compelling case to return some key industries such as energy, water, Royal Mail and the railways to public ownership. Polling evidence shows that taking these industries into public ownership would be popular among voters. The left should be more bold about campaigning for it. But it would be important too to consider different forms of public ownership and to avoid imposing a monolithic and technocratic state machine over these industries. Embedding the voices of stakeholders, such as workers, users and local residents in government structures would be vital. In particular, Any move to a publicly owned and better integrated rail network must be accompanied by a plan to improve connectivity to Britain's forgotten and declining coastal towns. So, I mean, I think as a principle, I would have no pushback about what Paul Embery said with regards to public ownership of the energy grid, the water sector, Royal Mail, railways, and so on. My reservation was always, and he does allude to it here though, is the manner in which that nationalisation is managed, isn't it? You know,
Yeah.
we've seen, particularly in the 70s and the 80s, the capitalistic nature of the way in which public sector organisations like British Coal, like British Leyland were run.
Mm.
And obviously we wouldn't want to seek a return to that. But what's your reflections on what Paul Embery said there?
Well, I think we've said this before. Yes, everyone, if you said that as that this is what we will do, and I think every postman would put his hand up to be renationalised as opposed to being the shit state they're in now.
Mm.
Now, as we've said, it is no good going back to that if someone is sitting on a board of directors running it and they can run it into the ground and the state has to bail it out. It has to be done via the state for no profit. It's got to be no profit because the Royal Mail was never run for profit, which is why I suppose postmen were given the job and finish and all this caper and they could do the round. Whereas now they're not getting any more work out of them, but they're there doing the full hours so that they haven't learned. But that to me, it would be that is a dream. That would be great, but it would have to be run by not by a company, as you said, like British Leyland, for profit. There's got to be no profit in it, and so therefore it wouldn't happen. If they're going to take they're going to take it off these people, nationalisation with no compensation.
Absolutely.
Then that's a different matter. Do that, and then run it that way. That's fine. But if you've got to start taking away whatever money's there, pensions and things like that, to pay off shareholders, then no, it's never going to work. You'd be
No,
just
of
doing
course
what you
not.
do now.
And I mean, if you look at some of the industries that he cites, energy is the one that sticks out to me. As things stand, why would a ruling class party that's put in there by the ruling class, why would they take away the ruling classes or one of the ruling classes' big sources of profit, the energy sector?
Well, they wouldn't.
Why would they privatise? Why would they nationalise that when they are basically gouging people for money in terms of energy costs, and they're going up again in January, lest we forget.
Yeah.
You know, absolutely no motivation for a Labour Party or a Tory party or indeed any other bourgeois party to nationalise energy because it's an absolute money printing machine. Why
Yeah.
would they? Why would they? You must be bonkers. The other thing, of course, the water sector, as we've seen with the trials and tribulations of Thames Water, the nationalisation of the water sector would be a welcome step, of course, because I think the maintenance of the water grid has to be in the hands of the state, whatever that state might be.
Mm.
The issue, of course, is that the water companies have amassed billions in debt, borrowing money at cheap interest rates to maintain their infrastructure. They haven't done it out of their own money. And I remember writing an article for the Class Consciousness Project about the Thames water issues. And in layman's terms, for every £1 you pay on your water bill, 33p is clear profit. 33 pence.
Mm.
So of the 66, 67p that's left, they have to maintain their own infrastructure, service debt, pay wages, and all those other things, to the point where I think it's something that I have to go back to the article again, but it's something like 20p out of every £1 you pay on your bills actually goes into the infrastructure and the maintenance of it.
That's it, isn't it?
Whenever they had to do big scale projects like Thames Water are doing over near where I work in East London, they're borrowing the money from the banks. But of course, they got caught out because they were borrowing off the banks at a rate of about 1 or 2%. And of course, interest rates are around about 5% now. So their repayments have gone through the roof, and that's what's put Thames Water in the position it's in. Now, the point I'm making is that it would be absolutely acceptable for the state to take water back into ownership, but what a mess they would inherit. What a mess. I mean, the question I would put, would Thames Water, for instance, be forced to default on its debt? Would the banks accept the state taking Thames Water over without compensation and leaving that £3-4 billion of debt unpaid? Would they accept that? Would they allow that? I strongly doubt it. I strongly doubt it. It's this idea of nationalising industries, including Royal Mail. Totally agree with that. I think it's been a complete mess since it got privatised. Railways are, to a great or less degree, state owned at the moment anyway, and have been since COVID. But I think we need to have a much clearer model of what nationalisation of our industries in this country is going to look like, and this is essentially a capitalistic application.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, in a socialist society, all of these entities would be state owned, and all of these entities would be run by the people that work there. That would be it, because they're the experts. The best placed people to run energy companies and water companies and deal with the mail and run the trains are the people that do it every day.
That would be a good idea.
Well, under a socialist system, that's exactly what we would get. So on that, we'll move on then to page 185, and it's on the topic of vocation. So Embery says, quote, "The fashion for viewing some jobs as dirty or menial or undertaken only by the less bright is at the root of many of the problems we face in industry and society. It was presumably this type of thinking that led the Tony Blair government to dream up a crackpot plan to push 50%, a seemingly arbitrary figure, of young adults through higher education. The consequences of this policy can be seen today in the number of young adults who spend years working hard at university only to leave with degrees which prove to be of little value and then end up doing jobs they would most likely have secured anyway. They can also be seen in the crippling lack of British workers with vocational qualifications and skills, plumbers, builders, electricians and such like, which is in particular the reason we have become so reliant on cheap imported labour." Again, this is one of the points that Embery's repeatedly made, not just in this book, but in his media and social media output. We put too many people through university. And it's a point of view that I do agree with. We've abandoned largely putting people through schemes to train them as builders and plumbers and electricians and so on. And I think, and I'm slightly generalizing here, I don't know what your view is, but we seem to have given young people the opportunity to go to university by default and not go to university because it's a pathway they have to take to get to a job, like, for sake of argument, a doctor, or for sake of argument, a lawyer at the end of it. So what are your thoughts on the number of people we put through higher education?
Yeah, I agree. It's too high because it massages the unemployment figures. And you're probably right. After they've come out of university after 3 years and they've picked a subject, not denigrating what subject they pick, business studies, for argument's sake, and they're looking around for a job that's doing this. There's nothing to do. So they go and get a job at Tesco.
Yeah.
But they could have had that job 3 years before and earned all that money and put towards a pension in that time, in that 3 years. So I do think there's too many, and it was at the time of Blair, of rising unemployment, I suspect, and them saying, well, at least they're off the employment figures and we're showing that we're educating our youth. Doesn't matter what they do after; it's a load of bullshit because they're not going to do the job that they go in for generally, unless you're going in to be a dentist or a doctor or something like that. But those, see, we've spoke about this before. When I was at school, if bright kids wanted to go to university, Usually they were going to be a teacher or a doctor or a lawyer or something of that nature. And other kids who weren't as bright as them went in for an apprenticeship, whether it be a joiner, a plumber, or went to work in a car factory as a tool
Yeah.
fitter, whatever it was. And they got an apprenticeship of 4 years on menial wages, but then they come out the time on decent money. Now, this was a point that was brought up at the industrial meeting the other week when they did the bridge in Scotland. I might be getting the I won't remember the name of the bridge, but they employed 200 Romanian welders
Yep.
to come over and do the welding because they didn't have any, because no one had been trained, and because we were talking about the need to increase. And Tam said, "Well, why would you need to increase apprenticeships when you're not going to need the welders because you're just going to get them from abroad on cheap labour," which is what happened. And
Yep.
that's one of the points here. You send them all to university. You don't need people to train up to be apprentices because you're just going to employ people from Romania or whatever it might be to come and
Yeah.
do major production work like that. Because in fairness, I don't know when the last ship was built, but as I pointed out to our local MP, and she was talking about what the Alison McGovern, no, not my local MP, but she's MP for Birkenhead. She put on Twitter about what the Labour Party were going to do about employment, and I said, yeah, why don't you open Camel Herds and start building ships, and thereby we would have to open steel works to make our own steel, and thereby we would have to open coal mines so we could have coal to make the steel and then
Yep.
to go to the shipyards. I said, but at the bottom, but you won't do that, Alison. You'll talk about creating growth and jobs and just build another shopping park for somebody to
Yep.
go in on a 0-hour contract on minimum wage.
Yep.
And then they turn around and say, well, the minimum wage is a decent wage. I always believed, as we've said, that the minimum wage is a maximum wage. And when it came in, I said that at the time. This will be used to stymie any, and like I think it was you said, was you? We would give rid of the minimum wage and bring back collective bargaining.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And again, going back to the point we were making earlier on, and Paul Embery was making about the way that trade unions organise these days, is it any wonder that the vast majority of minimum wage jobs are in the private sector, where there is minimal trade union organisation?
Absolutely.
You know,
yes.
The fact of the matter is that there are almost no jobs I can think of, unless they're contractors, that work in the public sector for minimum wage. Almost none. Now, some people who are advocates of the trade union movement would say, well, that's because they've got trade unions. They can negotiate higher wages. That's true. But look at what happens when the trade unions abandon sectors. Look at the care industry. Look at the crappy money, the long hours, the understaffing that's almost routine in that industry.
Yeah.
And they've got minimal trade union organisation. That's why they're such terrible places to work. You know, it's no accident. But yeah, you're absolutely right. What we have for a long time in this country been seemingly perfectly happy to send young kids to colleges and universities to get degrees that they don't need for jobs that they're going to end up in and could have done if they left school 3 years earlier, while at the same time importing plumbers, builders, electricians, truck drivers, all kinds of other workers.
That's the point, isn't it?
And that's a very, very difficult situation to make sense of. You know, why would a state do that? Why would a state send its own kids to university to get bullshit degrees they don't need and then import workers that they do need? And you know, just to pick up on what you were saying about your discussion with that member of parliament, we now have a government in power that would rather not open a shipyard to keep a steel mill open, and to keep a steel mill open so that a coal pit can be reopened. They would much rather invest billions and billions of pounds of taxpayer money in crappy green technology that doesn't work. It would much rather do that.
Yeah.
It would much rather that, because it would come out with all these bollocks about, oh no, we can't reopen that shipyard because the coal that we need to make the steel to make the ships is an environmental threat. You know, it damages the environment. Even though we are an incredibly small island, and we're not talking about opening every pit, and we're not going to talk about keeping open every steel mill. We're talking about opening a few coal pits to keep a few steel mills open to build a few ships. But they would much rather waste billions on solar panels and windmills that don't bloody work. Because
Yeah.
really, the long and the short of it is that green technology doesn't have to work. It just has to be money funneled from the state into a private sector's pockets to make crap that doesn't work.
Yeah.
And
It
someone
just
somewhere.
ticks some. It just ticks some boxes somewhere.
Exactly. So I mean I don't foresee in the near future any situation covered by that particular passage that Paul Embery's written to change. I still think we'll consistently push youngsters into university to do degrees they don't need, maybe not even complete the degree, and waste 2 or 3 years of their lives doing something they didn't even need to do or couldn't complete anyway, and find themselves back on a minimum wage job. Okay, then we'll move on to the bottom of page 186. So changing tack slightly, we're talking about social stability and solidarity. Quote, economic radicalism must ultimately be matched to a social agenda that also appeals. And this is where Labour and the wider left have come unstuck. So far as they have attempted to court voters in working class communities, it's hardly by promising more pounds in their pocket and by refashioning the economy in their favour. This is attractive only to a point. For if fine words about economic justice are not accompanied by a plan that takes account of these voters' social aspirations and speaks to their vision of the type of society in which they wish to live, it is unlikely these days, as we have seen, to command mass support. Labour and the left must therefore begin to speak candidly about social and cultural topics, what might be called the doorstep issues that voters wish to talk about, but which cause many of their activists to break out in a sweat when they are raised in a conversation. And obviously, one of the key issues that would make most Labour and most leftists very uncomfortable talking to people on doorsteps, immigration. Not the only subject, but that's the one that springs to mind for me. I mean, what's your take on what Paul Embery's touched upon there?
They do want you to talk about certain things on doorsteps, and it would make people sweat if you wanted to speak. Someone asked about immigration on the doorstep, and how would they answer it? They said, what are they doing to stop immigration? Because they've been asked, and he says, we are going to stop it, and it hasn't stopped.
No.
People say to me, it's mass immigration. I said, well, but we have discussed that chapter, and that was a good chapter, that one on immigration. And this is just more of the same. He's harping back to what he did in the past, isn't he, about that? If we're going to use immigration as a doorstop issue, that might make them sweat. But yeah,
I think the thrust of what Paul Embery's saying is that all Labour can do in their current state is to promise to working class voters, we might put a few more pennies in your pocket and we might help the economy.
Oh yeah,
around you, shall we say? So you might have more stable work, you might have a better cost of living. I mean, let's be clear. Lots of working class people in the United States voted for Donald Trump more or less purely on the basis that the prices were too high, and they thought Trump would somehow bring them down. Now we'll see if he will. I don't think so. But the pounds and pennies issues are what affect people. But I think what Embery's saying here, it has to be more than just putting a few pennies more in the pocket of a working class person to make a working class person come on board. You know, you have to look at what he says, social aspirations and the vision for the type of society that they wish to live in. You know, and there's a lot of, I suppose there are signifiers, aren't there? They're identifiers of what is to some a society in decline. So the number of children that are born to unmarried couples, for instance, the rate of crime, even the sort of shops that your parade of shops near where you live have, that they used to have years ago compared to then and now. You know, those sort of things are signifiers to a possible decline of closure of local employers, things like that. And it's those things that any party that wants to engage with the working class has to address. The trouble is, I don't think they will, because they are all wedded to capitalism, and capitalism is why you have this atrophying of society. It's why your parade of shops isn't anything like as good as it used to be 30 years ago. And it's
Yeah,
why so many
that's
people aren't settling down and getting married and having children, and because they're completely atomized. And some of the doorstep issues like LGBTQ rights, immigration,
exactly.
crime, um, the loss of employment in the area. The Labour Party's got no answers. That's why it doesn't like talking about it on the doorstep.
That's correct.
Hmm.
Well, but I mean, he's saying here now. Embery says there is a place for campaign over human rights, climate change, trans rights, etc. Palestine, migrants' rights, blah 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 blah. But any party mover that constantly places these causes front and centre cannot aspire to serious electoral force. Now, I tend to agree with that, but with the likes of climate change, trans rights over the rights of, say, people who ask, well, what's happening to my street, like you've just said.
Yes.
So obviously it's an issue, and it's an issue that they can't answer, because the people who knock on the doors do not agree with the leadership. I don't believe they can't. They're members of the Labour Party. You say to them, I spoke to one the other day in Asda, and I said to him, well, what do you think about this guy, Starmer? Then, he's your MP, he's your guy, your leader. Well, he's only trying his best. He says, trying his best, you're a pensioner like me. But I don't need the winter fuel payments. I says, no, but lots do.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's just an example. What about money sent to Ukraine? What about non-arguments against Israel? Why has this happened? Why has he aligned himself with Israel as opposed to Palestine? They're all awkward issues. Now, it was awkward for him because he couldn't
Yeah.
answer me. So
Yeah.
how awkward would it be for the MP when he
Well,
wants to
exactly.
say something, when he knows if he does say it, he's going to get a bollocking?
Okay, let's move on. So we're on the bottom of page 188 now. Research carried out for the Centre for Social Justice, for example, shows the UK to have one of the highest percentage of lone parents in Europe. Half of all children will not grow up with both parents, and over 1 million have no meaningful contact with their fathers. Critically, the consequences of family breakdown for these children are often dire, with an increased chance of their turning to drugs or alcohol, suffering from depression, performing badly at school, developing behavioural problems, and living in poverty in the future. The whole of society pays when families break up. What on earth is socialist about turning a blind eye to all this? Why should anyone on the left not wish to avert such outcomes for young people? What's your take on what Paul said there?
Well, he's right. But society should be affected, and we should be concerned whether you're on the left or not about outcomes for young people. But it all stems back from what we've said before: lack of jobs breeds to, well, I mean, I don't know. You say it's lack of morals. I don't know what the word is, Jason, because mostly when I was young, people met somebody, they got married, they settled down, they had children, one worked or they both worked, whatever they did, they could afford it. Now no one's got any money, so maybe there is this, business of people are having kids and they're not equipped to cater for them, so they're not going to get married. I don't know, but there's a lot of single women live on this estate,
Mm,
um, and there's a lot of unruly kids. But I'm not blaming them. It's the state, the system that's allowed this to happen,
mm.
because there is nothing for them to do. There was a youth club in the town. It shut down to build flats, and it was used. They should open the schools. They built a new doctor's surgery in the middle of it. Was a local village hall that used to have events and stuff like that. That's going now that the surgery's gone. So where do they go? You know, where do the kids go?
Yeah, exactly.
Sit in the park with a packet of Woodbines and can Stella.
Yeah, exactly. I think, I think the other fundamental point is, and it's summed up in the last line of the little passage I read out, is that the left as a body, this is one of the issues. Maybe it's a doorstep issue, I don't know, but this is an issue that they are desperate not to talk about, because I believe that they think that talking about the institution of marriage, about being married before you have children and so on, is essentially a conservative view. It's a conservative, might be small c conservative, but it's a conservative view. And so the problem that the left has is that it defines itself by just stepping away from certain issues like that. So what I mean by that is the conservatives, I don't know about this modern conservative party because they're not very conservative, but a conservative party back in the day would say, no, we believe in the institution of marriage. We believe that people should not have children out of wedlock. We believe that the best people to raise children is a married couple composing of a mother and a father.
Mm.
And the left, over a period of time, have peeled themselves away from that particular view to the point where they don't believe anything, to be honest. They don't believe anything in this regard. Their belief in terms of the institution of marriage and children and so on is to not have a view. Whatever the conservatives think, they don't want to think that. But you can't nail them down on anything. You can't nail them down. Do you think children, for instance, do you think children are best brought up in a stable home where mother and father are married? You ask a leftist that question, and they get that same flop sweat dripping down their back as they get when you ask them about immigration. They don't want to answer it because often, particularly on the left, the minute you cut right, what they're terrified of is framing themselves as possibly a conservative.
Mm.
That's what they're most worried about. So their position is not to have one at all.
Yeah, it'd be best framing themselves as a human being and have a bit of thought for people.
Well, exactly.
That might get more people wanting to vote for the person.
And it's also why of all the most outspoken people on the left, Paul Embery is often the most attacked because he has a position. And people, I mean, I've seen, replies to, because I follow him on Twitter, I've seen replies to some of his texts and people just say, oh, you're far right, you're right wing, you're this. It's like, oh, come off it. Stop being an idiot. Because that's how the modern left frames people. You make one statement about one topic and that's it. If I was to go on Twitter now and say, I believe that children are best raised in a stable home where both parents are married, I would lose God knows how many followers. God knows how many followers because I've come out with a conservative point of view. And therefore, everything I believe in is of a conservative point of view. So this is a something of an elephant in the room that the left just can't deal with. It just can't. So let's press on because we've only got a couple of bits still to do. Bottom of page 191. The Brexit vote threw into sharp relief the strength of opposition amongst the working class to open borders. The opposition was not born out of xenophobia or racism, nor, as many on the left want to claim, was it merely a proxy for other grievances. It was their considered judgment after witnessing the impact of such a policy on their lives, communities and country. The policy of open borders has commodified humanity in the interest of capital, causing downward pressure on the wages of many workers, undermined social solidarity and cohesion, and ultimately made toxic the entire debate about immigration in our country. So, Terry, what are your reflections on that?
I believe that people have just had enough, and it was given in some respects they were given an opportunity to vote, and they thought, right, now we're going to show them they don't want this, so we're going to do it just to be spiteful, whatever the view.
Yeah.
To show that we've still got some teeth and we can make a bit of a roar. Now, whether they thought about open borders and all that business, maybe they did, but a lot of them will have thought about, well, if we get Britain, we can control our own country. We haven't got to be controlled by somebody else. That was one of the issues that people gone about, and I think it was an important one. And he's right. It was nothing to do with being xenophobic or racist. as many on the left would call us, and probably you have, and I know I have, for being Brexit. And then they assume that this is your left wing. If you voted Brexit, you must be a fascist.
Isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
I remember at it was at Labour Party conference. It was in 2019. They had a load of people standing outside. It was at the Brighton Centre. They had a load of people standing outside with placards saying Brexit is a racist project. And these people, frankly, are idiots. If they think that Brexit in and of itself was a racist far right project, then I've got a bridge in London I can sell them, because there were so many concurrently happening phenomena that caused people to vote for Brexit. One of them was one you alluded to, a great chance to give the ruling class a kick in the bollocks that it deserved for quite a long time.
Mm.
You know, bearing in mind the vote was in 2016. We had 6 years of pretty brutal austerity. We've seen communities hollowed out. There were people that had real concerns about the changing demographic in their areas because of, frankly, unbridled immigration, especially from Eastern Europe. You know, obviously these people were coming here honestly looking for work, but the working class areas that they ended up in were not considered, and the consequences on them wasn't considered either by the ruling class. They just wanted some cheap, hyper exploitable, very educated labour, and the Eastern European plot gave them that opportunity. But you know, the long and the short of it is that, you know, the judgment after witnessing the impact, as he said, such a policy, the seismic changes that it's had on areas, places I used to work in, like Barking, which had a huge demographic change, as we touched upon on I think it was on our first episode when we were talking about the closure of the Ford works at Dagenham and the seismic effect that had on the area. And, you know, it's the problem on the left is they hear the problems that the locals in these areas are highlighting, and they get told that they're racist in return, and they're told that they're being bigots in return, and they're told they just have to get used to it because that's what the new world's like.
Mm.
And that is giving short shrift to people's legitimate concerns. Now, you can explain that the ruling class have a very, very cynical view about where they place immigrants. They don't place them in middle class areas or upper class areas. They'll always place them in working class areas, having stripped out all their services and having stripped out all the amenities and everything else that makes us a community worth living in. But the long and the short of it is they still have these concerns, and unless you're prepared to listen to them and listen to things that are uncomfortable as well, you're not going to get anywhere, are you?
But it's just a point I was going to make right at the end, and it's something he said that people say that the Labour Party is a busted flush. Well, I think after all this, I'm inclined to agree that it is.
Yeah, exactly.
That would be my final point on the.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've come to the end of the book. It has taken a while, 6 episodes of this recording, but I said at the very beginning, I read this shortly after it was published. I got it as a Christmas present. I read through the book in 4 days. It's a very good read, very well paced, very well written. And at the time, when I first read it, I believed it could serve as a blueprint for any working class based political party in this country. My understanding has changed in the 4 years since I read the book. And I now do not believe that bourgeois politics is the route through which the working class will find their liberation. I think the only way the working class will find their liberation is to sweep away the system that we live under and replace it with socialism and eventually communism. So reading this book, I would certainly still say it could serve as a blueprint for a bourgeois social democratic party that was seeking power. But I believe social democracy has its own inherent limitations, and it ends up only serving the interests of imperialism.
Mm-hmm.
And whilst it's an enjoyable book, and I found myself fundamentally disagreeing with the final chapter and the conclusions that Embery drew. I do agree with some of the problems he identified, but in the final analysis, his solution won't fix the problems that he's identified. What were your impressions of the book looking back?
Yeah, I enjoyed the book. I found a lot in the book that I could agree with. The immigration chapter to me was I agree with a lot in that he said. But at the end of the day, yeah, having read it the first time, and then probably because we've seen things change that he wouldn't have seen when he wrote the book, that might have, clouded me view. I don't think the book. I'd recommend anyone to read the book. It's a good read, but it's not the solution. And maybe if the Workers' Party want to sit down in a study group and study the book, then they might see some salvation and get themselves elected to some seats. I don't know. But I know that book is not the way forward for us.
Yeah, I agree. So in closing, Despised, While the Modern Left Loathes the Working Class and Polity Books is available on Amazon and other good booksellers. There's your copy too. That's old. There you go. We've read it. I recommend you read it. Despite the fact that we disagree with the conclusions that Paul Embery draws, I do recommend you read it. It is quite a thought-provoking and well-written book. But for now, we'll end our book review. I want to thank you, Terry, for joining me for these 6 episodes. It's been fun. Some of the subject matter has been quite heavy, but unpacking it has been very enjoyable, and I'm happy to have you come along with me and go on this journey together.
Yeah, I was happy. You saved me through the woke business. I winged it through that, so I'll have to say I was on your coattails.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Issue, but we got through it together in the end.
We got through it together, and for those of you watching, thank you for watching. If you've watched all 6 episodes of this review, thank you very much for your support. Like and subscribe this video if you've enjoyed it. My website is middleagedrevolutionaryblog.com. Latest uploaded article I've written is an article controversially in praise of Wetherspoons. I hope that you read and enjoy it as much as I enjoyed writing it. But for now, I'm going to say goodbye, and I'll say goodbye to my comrade Terry. Thanks for joining me today.
Bye, Jason. See you again.
Thank you. Cheers.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.